To you. Welcome to our Mainstreet Masters series by Mainstreet SA. I'm David West, your host, and we're talking this morning about trends in main streets and town centres over the past couple of years with an expert in the field. We're really delighted to have with us this morning Matt Wagner from Mainstreet America. Hello, Matt. How are you?
Good, David. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Our audience may remember that Mainstreet SA had Matt on previously a few years ago, and he made some really good predictions and talked about some trends of main streets and where they were going. And today's going to talk about what has happened since that time and what sort of trends are coming around the corner. So I'd like now to hand over to Matt. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David, and good to be with everyone. What would be your next morning? I'm still on Wednesday, so I got a little catching up to do, but we'll get there. I'm going to go ahead and share screen and walk you through some of my hopefully my best thinking on the topic. And hopefully you all can see this. David, maybe you just give me a quick thumbs up so I know that everyone can see. Wonderful. Yep. All right. Well, as David mentioned, I'm talking to you a little bit about sort of forward thinking in our predictions for small business and our commercial districts here in the U.S. But I think there's a lot of certainly, as we've seen in the past and on previous trips in Australia, there's a lot of sort of macroeconomics and consumerism at play that relate across the globe in many respects. So I think a lot of this will ring true, hopefully for you all as well. I also mixed in, as David mentioned, I've been doing a sort of prediction series since the pandemic, and I went back just a couple of years and shed a couple of hits and some misses. You know, it's always you've got to have a little bit of humility when you're out in the predictions world. And while I try to hedge my bets as much as possible by studying trends and trying to understand what's happening in the more macro marketplace, there certainly could be some misses along the way, and I'm, humble enough to admit them. And I'm going to share a few with you. All right, so let's go ahead and dive right in, and we'll look back at the last couple of years. I'm not sure if I want to call it post-pandemic, but we'll consider it as such. I think, once we entered into 2022, we were actually starting to see many more like new norm conditions within the marketplace that provided certainly a little bit more clarity than what we had in 2020 and 2021, where if you just looked at e-commerce, for example, during that time period, in a 2-month period of time in April and May of 2020, e-commerce grew at the same rate in that 8 weeks that took the previous 8 years to achieve. And so it was incredibly dynamic. And we saw then the pendulum swing, and I'll mention this in just a bit, to bricks and mortar in a post-pandemic. And that same sort of growth horizon, but then the pendulum seems to then equal out a little bit and come to some normalcy. But some of the wins that I like to think about as we look at some past predictions, I had called in 2023, I suggested that we would see a pivot to more service, that the retail horizon, likely bricks and mortar especially, but even in e-commerce, that consumers would begin to, they were spending like there was no tomorrow during the pandemic. And at some point, you sort of run out of the need to buy more Peloton, machines or furniture or office wear, and you turn to sort of service and hospitality and leisure. And that's certainly the dynamic that we saw in 2023. Was that pendulum swing to more service elements. 2022, if we go back even another year, I had predicted that the retail and restaurant labor constraints that much of the world was under because of the pandemic, and even coming out of the pandemic, with here in the US, we called it the Great Resignation. There were massive quit rates that what that would necessarily do, because if you look back in history, we saw the same thing occur in agriculture and manufacturing, that when you have cost constraints by labor and labor or workforce constraints, you will see a pivot to the adoption of more technology and automation. And I think that's exactly what we saw in the retail and restaurant world. Now, some of that was because of the pandemic. So things like QR code ordering and that sort of thing were more prevalent. But we certainly saw things like order at counter and pickup, to help with staffing issues, especially in restaurants. That was a pivot that was made. We're seeing much more like self-checkout. Now, there's some concerns about, some theft and that sort of thing that was on the rise as a result, but many places went to self-checkout, or a portion of self-checkout. And then AI is the next big wave, and I'll hold off a little bit of take, but there were some early adopters at that point. Some of the misses during the last couple of years, I would say, is I did think that the bricks and mortar retail rise would continue a little bit longer, I should say. But it did have the same cycle and almost the same time period cycle as the e-commerce growth that I just referenced, that happened in 2020 and 2021. We saw bricks and mortar really power through 2022 and into 2023, but the numbers in 2023 really began to slow down on the brick side of the equation in the sort of second quarter and into the third quarter. Now, some of that was not necessarily drawn away towards e-commerce, but to my win, and I should have known I was contradicting myself, was the service and leisure, people taking more trips, et cetera. And that sort of took the acceleration out of the bricks and mortar retail spend, at least here in the US. And then also in 2022, then I sort of missed on what was happening with my remote work. I thought that there would be a faster sort of reconfiguration of the downtown office market to more housing and short-term or mid-term rental markets. And that didn't necessarily happen. And I think part of that has to do with the expense of some office platforms structurally. They're just configured different. And so the adapter reuse isn't as easy as one might think. And so like capital markets, trying to pivot there, it definitely is more expensive to do. And then our smaller downtowns, unlike the central business districts of larger metropolitan areas, they didn't experience the same office vacancy that you see in places like San Francisco, or New York or Philadelphia, Chicago, where our offices are based, certainly experienced that. But most of our downtowns didn't, and people came back to work, or they just didn't have the percent of office as a portion of their CBD like the larger cities do. So I sort of missed on that conversion, at least the pace of that conversion. Now, looking ahead into 2024, as we embark on this new year, I think there's a conversation shift happening within our world of Main Street and working with small businesses and the real estate markets there. That the conversation used to be really around, at least lately over the past 5 or 6 years, has been about bricks versus clicks. And I think that dynamic is really shifting. And in fact, it shouldn't be bricks and clicks. It needs to be bricks and clicks. Salesforce.com did this wonderful sort of prediction and analysis last year that really showcased, and I think came through, that if you're a bricks and clicks operation, you're going to grow at 1.5 times the rate of just a bricks or a click standalone. And so I think that sort of competitive positioning is wrong and can actually be harmful to Main Street businesses. We should be embracing e-commerce as a strategy to grow our markets, grow our trade areas, maintain consumer touch, And the way that we hold the bricks, because we don't want that to disappear, is that we convert the conversation to experience versus transactional. And what I mean by that is, you know, the in-store experience has its consumer base. You know, there are time periods and products that where the experience is actually part of the value add of buying the product, and people seek that out, whether it's to be in a wonderfully designed place that you feel comfortable, that the music, the smells, the lighting, it just really creates a wonderful experience to buy the product. And there's a value add increment to that, or there's a quality component that speaks to your lifestyle. And then there, even in the same kind of product line, you can have a transactional experience. Now, most transactional experiences are done because there isn't necessarily the affinity for the product. I mean, if you're just buying aspirin, you're generally not like comparing, and you're not looking for an experience in buying aspirin. Or the other day I had to buy a filter for the refrigerator. You know, I just needed the filter. I didn't need to have the experience of buying it. And so I think what businesses can begin to think about is, what product lines do they have that are purely transactional, and where time to purchase or convenience to purchase, or it's not really a hard decision, those things can be done online and very effectively, whereas the things that have more value or create that experience can be more in store. So I think that's where the conversation begins to go, and that's how a business can sort of complement and understand where its clicks components can be and where its bricks components can be. So it's not a versus, it's an and, but some distinction between how consumers think and make decisions about the products and services that they purchase. This is actually the same store. This is a store in Kansas. They're a florist. This is the interior of it, and this is what they do online. Transactional versus experience. The second prediction that I have about what we'll see happening more in 2024 is, we have been experiencing over the last few years this ever decreasing average retail square foot need. Okay. I'm not saying that retail, the number or the sales or anything like that, the number of retailers is shrinking, but how much retail square footage they need is shrinking, at least here in the US, but I suspect globally. A lot of that has to do with the whole like showrooming, logistic enhancements that don't require you to carry as much inventory perhaps as we used to have to carry. And so as a Main Street, where you have fixed buildings, and that can be problematic, because in our main streets, if that square footage is shrinking, but our buildings are fixed, sometimes it can be hard to divide those up. And so you've got someone that needs so many square meters, and you're too big for that. And they can't use all the space. And so it provides sort of a disconnect there. So what I see happening in this particular area is that we've got this wonderful opportunity, I think, to do some conversions, or change the business and real estate models that we're operating under. So I think there's two probable solutions for that. One, and this wouldn't really involve necessarily the real estate, but as a business, if the retail component is shifting, you can think about adding more service elements, okay, that would then use up that square footage. So like, a salon, or in this case, if we're talking about retail, adding more services, like a music instrument store that's then adding maybe repair services or lessons that you can get inside the store. That would be a service element that you would add in and provide incremental value to the square footage. And then If you're a retailer, you could think about like, or a service business, like a salon, a hair salon or a beauty salon, what have you. You could add like personal care products to that and really sort of stock up and use square footage. Typically that has more increased value increment, and now you've better utilized that square footage. The second thing I see happening is where we are thinking differently about occupancy. And what I mean by that is thinking about more complementary retail opportunities. This is out of Rock Springs, Wyoming. It's not in a big town or city or anything like that. There's a bike store, and inside the bike store is an espresso bar. And anyone that does a lot of cycling probably knows that maybe before or after the ride, you want to grab some coffee. They're very complementary sort of consumer groups. They add density and they share the space, even though they're two operators. Now, certainly some of that requires some work with the property owners around lease and either sublet conditions or what have you. But I think we'll see more of this sort of cooperative business setups where there's shared space. I'm starting to see concepts where there's actually a retailer in the front side during the daytime, roll back a curtain, and there's something else happening in the evening, same space, but different time periods. Micro retailing concepts where you've got a number of vendors, not like in an antique mall kind of concept, but where there's actual people operating each individual store, but in a very small micro kind of setup. Prediction number 3 revolves around this massive generational shift that's occurring. Now, here in the US, we've labeled this as peak 65. So 2024 is when here in the US, the population of 65-year-olds will peak. This will be the largest age group of hitting, or largest population hitting the age of 65 because of the baby boomer generation. And as such, there's a whole sort of host of consumer and spending and economic shifts as a result that are occurring. There's buildings that are being transitioned through retirements and or generation or passing down to younger generations. There are businesses doing the same thing, and spending capacity as people hit retirement age. Obviously, the spending may come down. And so the new consumers coming into the market obviously may have different taste and ways of accessing information. And the unfortunate thing is we have so many small businesses that I think have become used to certain like social media and ways of marketing that perhaps younger generations are not using those same things. And a good example, most small businesses here in the US use Facebook as a key social media marketing tool. Now, for age groups that are above 35 years of age, that probably works okay. But anything younger, those folks aren't necessarily on Facebook. And so what I think will be happening is we're going to see some key shifting and some needs to shift. Also from static content, photographs, to more video content, obviously. So 2 sort of sub-recommendations here are predictions. One, I think WhatsApp begins to explode. Globally, WhatsApp is much bigger than it is in the US, but the top age groups and demographic profiles of WhatsApp users tend to be from Latin America and Asia. And those are the fastest growing demographic segments here in the US and younger generations. And so I think WhatsApp, while it doesn't become the dominant player, certainly gets higher profile use. And then actually Pinterest is very interesting. What's happening with social media is becoming much, much more expensive to acquire new customers. The acquisition of new customer rates is much higher than actually having a bricks and mortar store versus an e-commerce only store. And so it's getting expensive because it's getting cluttered. Pinterest is fascinating. While the user base is small, the trust factor of Pinterest is off the charts. Most people that use Pinterest come to that platform without a brand in mind. They're looking for examples, you know, things that they can see and do, but they don't come with a brand in mind. So if you're on Pinterest, you actually have a much better opportunity to showcase smaller brands than they'll go out and search and find. But you're exposing them to the video or the example, and there's a lot of trust built in to that. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is that in terms of other ways of marketing, I think we're on the precipice of seeing an SMS explosion. SMS, so texting, you're probably already starting to get, you know, more messages from opt-ins from businesses that you currently go to or what have you, with sales or events or whatever. SMS has an amazing open rate and reaction rate. And so to actually do something, to take some sort of action, I mean, it just kills like social media platforms. Now, eventually that will also get expensive and likely cluttered and maybe annoying, but not yet. And so SMS appears to be the next big wave for small businesses to access consumers, stay in touch with consumers, et cetera. My fourth prediction, and you can imagine, is around AI. I mean, that's all the big talk, right, is in AI. And like e-commerce, I think these tools, the technologies that are being developed out there for so many years, our small businesses and main streets, because of their scale, weren't really able to sort of acquire or utilize. You had to be a big business. And I at least love that trend that, you know, technology is much more accessible at scale for much, you know, smaller resources in order to leverage. And we're already seeing the impact of this with many of our small businesses. Some of the near-term or long-term adoption that I suspect we'll see is more about like market research, which typically is really expensive, but with AI, you can do, you know, with certain parameters, you can acquire that, or, you know, using generative AI, understand what your markets are like much more better. Content development seems to be the key driver right now. A lot of small businesses are putting into, whether it's ChatGPT or Gemini at Google, or I forget the Microsoft version, but they're using it to develop, like almost like having your own business assistant. And the number one issue right now for small businesses, the impediments to adoption, is time and money. And this helps with both. And so if you're just putting in parameters around, I need a new post that describes this event I'm hosting, and here's my target audience for it, and a little bit about my business, and bingo, you can have like content developed, whether it's a blog or a media post, and be able to put that across platforms. That's a huge time saver versus sitting there for 2-3 hours trying to come up with what you're going to say in your next, you know, WhatsApp post or Instagram post or whatever it is. And then thirdly, is things get more sophisticated in understanding, is the predictive AI. Now, big business is already using this, of course, but I think smaller ones will be able to begin to enter their purchasing patterns and then be able to predict inventory needs and thus minimize like clearance items and that kind of thing. That will also further accelerate the square foot or square meter needs as a result, as they become more sophisticated with just-in-time delivery and inventory needs. That will have some effect on real estate in our districts as well. Number 5, what I'm sensing here is, if we think about our main streets as a ecosystem, that's supporting our small businesses, property owners, consumers. Oftentimes, what ends up happening is the focus of economic development tends to be in what we call high propensity ecosystems, mass manufacturing, high technology kinds of businesses, et cetera. And a lot of our support systems are built around those. The changing nature of humans, of us, in terms of having mobility and being able to make decisions on sort of our quality of life, the things that we do actually build quality of place and build experience, something that people are yearning to be engaged with their community, be engaged with one another, feel connected to a place. With high propensity businesses, what they need is human capital. And human capital is driven towards the things that we are doing. That's where the intersectionality comes into play. And I think it will play out in a number of different areas. One is our main streets might have unique housing opportunities. That's attractive to the human capital that these other sort of high-tech or manufacturing-based ecosystems need. They need third spaces, places for these accidental collisions, our breweries, our tap rooms, our libraries, our cafes, our salons, people, where you can like hang out and become engaged. They need broadband infrastructure. In many cases, we've got great infrastructure running through our main streets. It's very easy to tap in to fast speed that is required by these industry types. Professional services that you might need, from marketing to legal to even civic, governmental, tend to be in our main streets. In some cases, it's where the incubators, accelerators, or shared kitchen facilities or co-work spaces are located. It's where your culture and entertainment venues typically are located, your museums, your theaters, et cetera, and your creative office environments. The structures that David has in his background speak to that, if you're looking into creative businesses, you want creative spaces that help to flourish that thought process. And then final prediction number 6 is, I think globally, you have what's called the age of dispersion. And what I mean by that is that as humans, like here I am in Virginia, and I'm able to have a conversation with all of you in South Australia. And just before this, I was telling Dave and Alex, I was in Hawaii. I wasn't literally there, but online. And I worked from home. And you can get education online. You can get medical care online. There's just about everything you can do online. But what that's led to is a feeling of loneliness and isolation and a yearning for connection that we all have as human beings. I think our main streets have a role to play in that, in relieving that. I think that's a really critical part of what we can do. We build community. We build a sense of place and togetherness. And that's powerful in an era in which you can be by yourself for long periods of time and isolated. And so what I see happening here is, I think many of our businesses, as a core component of their business, are moving not just into third space, which is, like having the space where outside of work and outside of home, but really in serving as kind of like micro communities. They're having events and activities and book readings and date nights and like where you're going like round robin, like I forget what that's called, like round robin dating kind of thing, like social aspects of community being brought into the business. And I think we'll see more of that as a core component aspect to our businesses in our main streets. Now, I only have one request of all of you, and I'll turn it back to David, is we've developed a new podcast called Mainstreet Business Insights, and we share a lot of the things that I was just talking about, but from the voice of the actual small business owner. I think one of the things that's missing in this era of dispersion is our ability to network and connect with one another. And businesses are feeling that. All of our research data suggests that they're feeling isolated, much like other humans are. Businesses are no different. They're human. And they still want to learn from each other and understand how other businesses are solving problems and finding solutions. And that's what this podcast is all about. So we're in season 2 right now. We've got about close to 20 episodes that are already up. And you can subscribe and listen anywhere you listen to your favorite podcast. And I hope you'll subscribe. And my other thought is it would be great if any of you out there know of a business that you might want to nominate. It would be great to have someone from South Australia on the podcast, a small business from one of your main streets. I think that would be a cool connection to make. And so I put my email address here. If you've got a recommendation, a business that you know that's maybe got a cool or unique or story or personal journey that's quirky or inspiring or makes something cool, we'd love to have them on the podcast. So we can certainly arrange for that. So that's it for me. I appreciate the time and certainly want to address any questions that you have.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. That was fantastic. We certainly will find somebody for you, no problem at all. And I've listened to a number of the series, and it's really interesting. What I've actually found is the loyalty to people's Main Street. You know, you talk to some lovely people who set up their business because they were really loyal. They want to see their street work, and they really want to see the whole neighborhood work and the whole community. It was some amazing stories in there, and I urge people to have a listen to those podcasts. They're fantastic. So thank you for that. I want to ask you about one question. Was in one of your predictions back in 2022, you were talking about the pivot. And of course, pivot became a word that we hadn't really heard of a lot, but then all of a sudden, this business is pivoting, that one's doing that. How have your little small businesses gone with some of the pivoting? Have they stuck to it, or they've gone back to more normal, or they've kept on pivoting with something new?
Yeah, I think what we saw is like American Express did a survey back in 2021 and then again in 2022. And what they were seeing, to your very point, is that like 76% of businesses were thinking they were going to pivot this year, and then the next year felt they were going to pivot. There was a lot of like constant pivoting going on to kind of find out where the new norms were. Certainly there was habit formation that occurred over the last few years with consumers. So a lot of the techniques and ways to reach consumers that were present in 2020 and 2021 still remain. So like if you pivoted towards changing your business model for how people like were served in your restaurant, you stuck with that. You didn't go back to the old way. So if people were ordering and picking up at the bar or the counter, if you were offering pickup services, you had to keep it because a fair amount of the consumer base that was using those sort of tactics to remain engaged liked them, and they've stuck with them. If you were doing delivery, you've had to keep that model and find some way to continue it, even if it sort of declined a little bit in use. You kind of had to stick with it. And so the movement towards more clicks and along with your bricks was another big shift. And we still have that where close to 50% of small businesses still do not have a really strong digital component to their business. We still have a long ways to go in that conversion. It's amazing how sort of slow it's been. In fact, this past year, we had a large investment from Google and had digital coaches all across the country. And we've trained 100,000 small businesses this past year. Wow. In developing digital content and tools.
Wow. The other one I was going to ask about was with the main streets, what happened with our vacancy level in the suburbs went way down. And as the people obviously working from home and shifted, have you found that the vacancy level has stayed quite stable? Because we've seemed to have found a sort of a quite stable level, but of course the CBD has had trouble with the work from home situation. Is that similar in America?
Yeah, the big there is a huge difference between large city CBDs, and I'm going to say anything over probably a 500,000 population and greater, versus suburban communities and small towns in the US. So we had two factors happening over the last few years. One was the explosion of entrepreneurship. In the US, they actually called it the rise of the COVIDpreneur. We had 4.5 million more new businesses formed between 2021 and 2022 than the previous years. I mean, it was just this massive acceleration. And many of them, and nearly 70% of them, were in retail. And so you had this massive like movement towards people wanting to start retail businesses. Now they may have been online or not bricks. So in our small towns, in fact, and our suburban communities, we actually had a deep decrease in vacancy rate. Like you can't find space in most of our main streets. They're at near 95%, 96% or higher occupancy. Polar opposite, David, in big city CBDs because of the office sector. Most CBDs in the US, large city CBDs, were totally dependent on the office worker. There wasn't a lot, there was growing housing residential, but not as much in like suburban, like density wise in suburban or small towns. And suburbia and small towns didn't have the density of office workers that were no longer coming to those spaces for work. So it's really a tale of kind of like two dynamics altogether. It just happens that most of our work is in suburbia or down small towns and not the central business districts of big cities.
We have a question, Michael, from Jensen Plus has asked about the success of main streets versus the shopping centres and the sort of successful retail sectors within those. How have you found the success factor?
Of different retail segments or sectors within our main streets. Restaurants over the last, I would say, decade, the primary driver, I think, of a lot of success was actually in the restaurant sector. Mm-hmm. I think what consumers were really transitioning to, and I think it actually had to do, I think, started with the whole Instagram, take a photo of your food. I really do. I think there's something to it. And people were taking picture of like everyone was a culinary expert and wanted to show what they were eating. And the only way that you could do that was through an experience of something that's unique and different. And those kinds of restaurant businesses were not out on like a highway. They're not fast food either. And they were locating in, historic buildings and in downtowns all across the country. And so we were seeing restaurant districts and entertainment districts really flourish. And I think to some extent that's kind of leveled off. Retail really emerged to a higher extent, but at a much higher price point. Some might refer that as like boutique shopping. And I think that's just, again, goes back to that experience versus transaction that I was speaking to earlier. In retail, like apparel markets and that sort of thing, you have transactional and you have experience. And most of that experience needs to be at a higher price point. And you're not going to find that in, like for us, like in a Walmart or something, or an online Amazon kind of marketplace. You're going to find that in a boutique. And we've still held strong in like personal services, professional services. We had a big boom in the outdoor rec market, like bike stores, sporting goods. That actually has declined. I think people bought up all that stuff during the pandemic and now maybe need its service, but they're not buying it as much. So that's kind of what my sense is right now.
I think your comments about the average square meter of retail is going to be very interesting because, of course, some of the stores in America are absolutely huge, and some of your bulky goods stores are really big. And I know that when people used to travel from Australia over there in the retail sector and go and have a look, and they go, wow, look at the size of some of these stores. It'll be interesting to see how that transfers to Australia, and how much downsizing there is, and reuse. It's a really interesting question, I think, and to see what happens with the trend compared to the
exactly.
big centers.
We're seeing that with currently with all like the request when new businesses are coming in, what square footage or square meter, are they requesting? And it just continues. And even the big players are developing smaller footprint stores. I mean, IKEA is going to develop a 3,000 square foot business model. I mean, they're usually, huge.
How do you get lost in there? You don't.
Yeah, exactly. But it's all showrooming now, and then you order it online and have it delivered, but you want the showroom, you want the experience of touching it and feeling it, sitting there, and then you can have it shipped.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Matt. That been just a valuable part of our Mainstreet Masters series, and we thank you for coming online and doing that, and our connection with Mainstreet America. We really value it. So thank you, and we'll certainly find a small business for you. But please keep up the great work, and thank you again for being part of our Mainstreet Masters series.
Yeah, really appreciate the invite as always. Thanks, David.
All right, thank you very much, and we'll see you later.
Okay. Take care, everyone.